Nutrition is arguably the most important factor when it comes to fat loss. You'll hear many people say abs are built in the kitchen, and you'll hear some people say you can't out-train a bad diet. And this video isn't about debating whether or not those statements are true, but instead I'm going to show you which food groups or items are best and worst for fat loss. I'm going to create a tier list, S to F, S being superior, F being the worst. But the F is also important because it's going to stand for flexibility, which I'll come on to. And I'm going to rank each of these foods through that tier list so you know which foods to potentially focus on or have more of when it comes to fat loss, and which ones to maybe have more in moderation or to stay away from a little bit more. And there might be a few that actually surprise you. You see, there's so much contradicting information out there regarding foods for fat loss that it's very difficult for a lot of people to know exactly what you should be eating. So the goal of this video is to make it pretty clear in terms of which foods you maybe want to eat more of and which more in moderation. Now, before we get into the tier list, let me talk about the properties of certain foods that are going to help me dictate where they sit in that ranking system. Now, very quickly, for fat loss to occur, we need to be in a calorie deficit, which means we're taking in less food than we are expending. So some of the properties of foods that help us do that and that we're going to take into consideration here are how calorie dense these foods are, how high in fiber and how much volume they have, how easy or difficult they might be to consume in moderation, their micronutrient content, so vitamins, minerals, and even flexibility and enjoyment. And these are the foods that we are going to rank. So we have lean proteins, fatty proteins, complex carbs, simple carbs, saturated fats, unsaturated fats, dairy, sugar, vegetables, fruits, sauces, and liquid calories. Now, are there potentially some that I've missed? Yes. Could we break these down even further? Yes. But I thought this was a good generalization of different food items or food groups to make this as simple and straightforward as possible. In no particular order, let's get into it. First, we have fatty proteins. Now, I'm going to put fatty proteins in at A. The reason being is protein is very important for our fat loss goal, given that it helps in terms of hunger management, helps us keep us feeling full and satiated, and protein is also very important for the retention of muscle mass. Now, the reason why fatty proteins don't go into category S is because they are high in fat. Fat being calorie dense, 9 calories per gram. So therefore, when it comes down to trying to manage our calories, fatty proteins are probably going to be a little less favorable for that exact reason. Next, we're going to look at simple carbohydrates. Now, just to quickly break this down so we're on the same page here, as a generalization, simple carbohydrates are going to be a little bit easier and faster for our body to digest and break down and use. So they're also typically a little less fibrous and maybe lower in volume, and they're also potentially maybe easier to consume. So we're going to throw this down into C. So the reason as to why it's in that sort of mid-ranking towards the lower end is because it can potentially be easier for us to consume a lot of these. And that means in terms of calorie control, potentially we might find it harder to control our calories with a lot of these food items. However, the reason why it's not down in D or F is because carbohydrates in terms of energy source can be very useful for us. And energy is important during fat loss when we're in a deficit, and we want to make sure we're trying to get the most out of our training performance, our activity levels. So carbs isn't something that I would completely avoid, but there potentially are better options, which we'll come on to, and that's why it's at C. Next, we have saturated fats. Saturated fats are typically stuff like your animal fats, and we're going to throw these in at D. Now, the main reason for this is a diet high in saturated fats isn't going to be favorable for our health or fat loss because fats are so calorie dense. Again, 9 calories per gram, which means if we're having a lot of saturated fats in our diet, it might be very hard for us to manage our total caloric intake and that calorie deficit. So not very favorable for fat loss. We're going to put them in at D. Next, we move on to complex carbohydrates. So as we spoke about simple carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates are potentially going to be a little bit more favorable for us because they're typically likely higher in fiber and volume, and therefore might make it easier for us to manage our total calories. Plus, they're still going to be a good energy source, and therefore we're going to throw them in at B. Just a very quick one while we're talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates aren't going to stop you from dropping body fat. Nothing in this list is going to stop you from dropping body fat. And a lot of people will talk about or suggest that removing carbs is the answer to fat loss, and it's just not true. But as you can see from this tier list, there's potentially some carbohydrates that might be more favorable due to their properties, as we've spoken about. But like I said, carbs can also be very useful for fat loss, just down to being a good energy source and keeping our activity and performance high. Next, we have liquids. Liquids I am throwing down into F, unless they are 0 calorie. Now, the reason I'm throwing them into F is because I'm looking at them having and containing calories. And if they do, liquids just are not going to be favorable for fat loss because they're not going to do anything for your hunger management. It's a very easy way to rack up a lot of calories and therefore make it hard to sustain your deficit. Now, if they were 0 calorie, like diet soda, artificial sweetener, I would actually put them higher up the list because I think they could be very favorable for you in terms of adherence and enjoyment. But going off most liquid calories out there, including oils, it's just not going to be favorable for our fat loss goal. So they're in the F category, but remember, F is also for flexibility. So anything in that category, I'm not saying to completely eliminate, but we definitely want to make sure we're having them in moderation. So I would keep liquid calories very, very limited. Next, we have unsaturated fats. So unsaturated fats are stuff like your monounsaturated, polyunsaturated. Now I'm throwing these at C, a little bit higher than saturated fats, simply because most people don't get enough unsaturated fats in their diet just for health. So from a micronutrient standpoint, unsaturated fats are important, but again, at the same time, they are fats, calorie dense, and therefore I wouldn't go over the top in terms of consuming them because it might just make controlling your overall calories harder. So we're throwing them in at C. Lean protein, our first S category. This is real simple. I've spoken about the importance of protein, but because these sources are now lean, it's also a great option for keeping our calories lower. So now we have high protein, low calorie options, perfect for our fat loss goals. Dairy. Dairy is a sort of middle ground option. I'm going to throw this in at B. Now, I think dairy can be a good staple within a diet. One, because most of dairy sort of products are decent for protein. But on the other hand, you also have some options that aren't fantastic. So for example, like cheese, where it contains protein and it's kind of okay, but it's also not high in protein in relation to the amount of calories it contains. Now, obviously, you're going to have different options here. For example, Greek yogurt, where the calories are definitely going to be lower, and therefore the calories to protein comparison isn't as bad. But dairy as a whole is like a good secondary protein option, but it also runs a risk of calories in relation not being fantastic. So we're going to stick that in as B, just because there's probably better protein options, but they're also still a decent choice. Next, we have sauces. Sauces I'm throwing in pretty low down at D, mainly because, again, like liquid calories, they're very similar. They can be pretty calorie dense. The only reason I'm chucking these above liquids is just because for adherence and enjoyment, sauces play a big part in people just enjoying their nutrition. They add more flavor, keep things a bit more interesting for people, a bit more variety, and therefore they probably play a slightly stronger place in diet adherence. Also, just like some liquid calories, you can get some very low calorie options or even some calorie free sauces out there, which can be helpful. So we're throwing them in at D. Again, I would use them sparingly or sensibly, but there's no need, as with anything, to completely eliminate them. Fruit we're throwing in at A. Now, a lot of people will talk badly about fruit because they contain sugar, which we're going to come on to, but fruit do a couple things pretty damn well. For the most part, they're pretty high in fiber and high in volume, which means they can be a useful tool for managing our hunger, keeping us feeling full, and they contain a lot of micronutrients. So for that reason, they're going in at A, because they can be very beneficial for our fat loss goal. Now, when we move on to sugar, which we're going to chuck in at F, and it's not because sugar is bad, it's not because sugar will stop our fat loss, but it is simply because sugar will not keep us feeling very full. Typically, high sugary foods are very calorie dense, and therefore, just for total calorie management, it is not very good. Again, that doesn't mean it's going to cause you to stop dropping body fat, but it might make it harder. So we're throwing these in at F. Again, that doesn't mean they need to be eliminated, but moderation is key. And then lastly, we're looking at vegetables, which we are chucking in at our last S tier option. You've probably at this point guessed why. Very high in volume, very high in fiber, great for keeping us feeling full, great for micronutrient content. When we look at fat loss, it is a very, very good option. If you increase the amount of vegetables that you consume, you will find fat loss easier. It is pretty much that simple. Now, if you want to get the most out of your vegetables, I would try and get vegetables that are high in volume, so take up a large space on your plate. That will really help with keeping you feeling full. And the only reason vegetables are above fruit, or should I say the only reason fruit is a little bit below vegetables, is just because typically fruit will contain more calories slightly than vegetables. So again, when we look at controlling calories as much as possible, vegetables do take that extra step. So there you have it. There's the tier list of foods for fat loss. Now, like I said, there's probably some that I didn't include. So if you want to throw in your own thoughts and opinions down in the comments, feel free. Some of this will come down to individual preference as well, especially in terms of enjoyment and adherence. Some people might want to put fat slightly higher if they find it easier to control them in terms of calories. But this is just my opinion in terms of a general overview. Now, if you'd like me to do other tier lists for other fat loss factors that you would like to know, if there's certain things you want to understand if it's better than other options, let me know in the comments too. If you did find this video helpful, please drop a like because it helps me. If you haven't already, do subscribe so you can keep up to date with all these videos that are going to help you in your fat loss. And lastly, as always, I do have a free fat loss blueprint, so if you want to grab that, grab the link down below in the description. I'll see you on the next one.